Don't look at the bread like that, Grace said softly. It might begin to feel important. The old man lifted his eyes. He had been counting the crumbs. Not eating them. Not yet. He moved each one into a careful little line with the tip of one weathered finger, as though 5 crumbs could become a meal if arranged with enough patience. Grace Bennett stood in the doorway of Ravenhall's abandoned baking room with an ash bucket pressed against her hip. She had come to empty the kitchen hearths before dawn, the task given to servants too unimportant to be missed and too poor to refuse. She had not expected to find anyone inside. The ovens had been cold since midnight. Frost silvered the narrow window, and the air smelled of old flour, wet stone, and the faint warmth still trapped inside yesterday's bread racks. The stranger sat beside the longest table. He was nearly 70, perhaps older, tall even while seated, with broad shoulders diminished by hunger rather than age. Silver hair fell across his forehead. His beard was neatly trimmed, which did not belong with the mud on his boots or the torn edge of his dark wool cloak. Neither did the way he sat. Beggars folded inward. Grace had seen enough of them beyond the servants' gate to know. Hunger bent the spine before it weakened the hands. This man sat straight. Even shivering, he watched both doors. Grace set down the ash bucket. "You are not supposed to be here. I suspected as much." His voice was rough, but carefully measured. Not the voice of a frightened trespasser. Grace glanced toward the corridor. If Martha Collins found him, she would call the guards. If she discovered Grace speaking to him, she would first ask which punishment would inconvenience the kitchen least. The old man looked back at the crumbs. Grace noticed his left hand tremble. Not dramatically, only enough to make him press it flat against the table. "When did you last eat?" she asked. "I am not asking for charity." "That was not what I asked." His mouth tightened. Grace knew that expression. Pride trying to perform the work of strength after strength had already failed. She reached into the pocket beneath her apron. The bread was still warm. Half a loaf, wrapped in linen, saved from the servant's supper. Beside it sat a small apple and a wooden token Samuel could exchange for broth after his morning work. It was all the food they had until evening. Grace placed the bread on the table. The old man stared at it, then at her. "I cannot pay. I did not name a price. You should keep it. So should you." His gaze sharpened, and for one strange moment Grace felt as though she had been examined by men behind judgment tables and found more interesting than expected. He looked toward the corridor again. "Someone may see. Then eat before they do." He tore off a small piece. Too small. Grace turned away and began stacking firewood that did not need stacking. She understood the mercy of pretending not to watch a hungry person eat. Behind her, the bread broke again. Slowly, carefully, not the way a man ate when he expected more. The way he ate when he feared this might be the last food offered to him for a very long time. "What is your name?" Grace asked. The silence before his answer lasted half a breath too long. "Henry. Only Henry." Grace nodded as though she believed him. Outside, the first watch bell rang across Ravenhall Castle. Henry counted the chimes without looking up. At the 7th, his hand stopped. Someone entered the corridor beyond the baking room. Henry's eyes moved toward the door. The hunger remained, but the weakness disappeared. "Grace," he said quietly, though she had never told him her name. "You need to hide me." The footsteps stopped outside the baking room. Grace reached for the old iron latch. Henry caught her wrist. His grip was weak from hunger, but the decision behind it was not. "Do not lock it," he whispered. "A locked door invites questions." Grace looked at him. That was not something a wandering old man should know. The footsteps moved again. A kitchen boy passed the doorway carrying a basket of onions, muttering about frozen hinges. He did not look inside. Henry released her. Grace closed the door halfway, leaving it open enough to appear unimportant. "How do you know my name?" His gaze lowered toward her apron. A small wooden tag had been pinned near the pocket, worn smooth by years of washing. Grace Bennett. She felt foolish for not remembering it. Henry said nothing about the relief that crossed her face. Instead, his attention shifted to the linen bundle still resting on the table. "You said someone may see," Grace murmured. "Who?" "A man who does not wish me well." That describes half the people inside Ravenhall. The corner of Henry's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Grace unwrapped the remaining bread and placed the apple beside it. Then she found a clay bowl on the shelf, filled it with the thin vegetable soup she had hidden near the oven, and set it before him. Steam rose between them. Henry stared at the bowl. That is yours. It was. You have not eaten. Grace began rearranging the firewood again. I have had busier mornings. That is not an answer. It is the one servants use when the truth would make powerful people uncomfortable. Henry studied her for a long moment. Then he pushed the apple back across the table. Keep this. My brother needs the broth token more than he needs an apple. And you? I know how to be hungry. Something changed in Henry's expression. Not pity. Recognition. He wrapped both hands around the bowl, letting its warmth enter his fingers before lifting the spoon. He ate slowly, with the careful restraint of someone determined not to appear desperate. Grace pretended to inspect the cold ovens. She listened instead. The spoon touched the bowl 3 times. Then stopped. You should eat while it is warm, she said. I am making it last. The honesty in his voice made her turn. For the first time, he looked old. Not powerless. Not broken. Simply tired in a way that sleep could not repair. Grace sat across from him. Eat first, she said. Pride keeps better on a full stomach. Henry looked down at the soup. Then he finished it. Every spoonful. When he reached the bread, he tore it into equal pieces before realizing there was no one else at the table. His hand went still. You share food by habit, Grace said. I did. With family. A shadow crossed his face. With my son. Grace did not ask whether the son was dead. People who wished to speak of grief usually found their own way toward it. Instead, she peeled the apple with a small kitchen knife and divided it between them. Henry accepted his half this time. Outside, boots crossed the courtyard in organized formation. Not servants. Guards. Henry's eyes sharpened. Grace heard voices near the kitchen entrance. One belonged to Martha Collins. The other was deeper, smoother, and immediately unwelcome. Lord Victor Hale. Henry rose too quickly. The room tilted beneath him. Grace caught his arm before he struck the table. For a man who claimed to be a traveler, his body carried old strength beneath the hunger. Scars crossed his wrist, pale and straight, the marks of blades rather than labor. His torn sleeve slipped back. A white band circled his ring finger. The skin there had been protected from sun for years by something broad and heavy. A royal signet, Grace thought, then dismissed it. Men who wore royal rings did not count crumbs in abandoned kitchens. Victor's voice sounded beyond the door. Search every room. Henry looked at Grace. This time, he did not ask for help. He expected refusal. Grace took the bowl from his hands, wiped the table clean, and opened the narrow door beside the ovens. The old wood storage room waited beyond it. Inside, she whispered, you could lose your position. I could. Why risk it? Grace met his eyes. Because hunger is not a crime. The outer door began to open. Henry stepped into the darkness. Grace closed the panel behind him just as Victor Hale entered the baking room. Victor Hale entered as though the room belonged to him. He did not raise his voice. Men like Victor rarely needed to. The authority in his dark coat, silver chain, and carefully polished boots arrived before his words did. Martha Collins followed 2 steps behind him, her mouth already tightened in suspicion. Grace, Victor said, why is this room warm? She looked toward the cold ovens. It is not. His gaze moved to the table. The bowl was empty. The apple peel had been gathered into Grace's palm. One corner of the linen wrapping remained damp from melted snow. Victor noticed everything. That was what made lying to him dangerous. We are searching for a trespasser, he said. An old man. Silver hair. Dark cloak. Grace folded the linen slowly. I have seen no one. Martha's eyes narrowed. Victor stepped closer. The scent of cedar oil and winter air clung to him, sharp enough to cover something metallic beneath it. Someone opened the southern servants' gate before dawn. Then you should question the gatekeeper. We did. And he is missing. The words settled heavily between them. Behind the oven wall, the wood storage room remained silent. Grace could hear nothing from Henry. That frightened her more than movement would have. Victor studied her face as if searching for the exact place fear had begun. Then the second watch bell rang. Henry had counted 7 chimes earlier without looking up. Grace remembered that now. A traveler should not have known Ravenhall's guard pattern. Most servants did not know it. The bells changed by season, by threat level, and by which gate carried the royal patrol. Henry had recognized every one. Victor turned toward the sound. The eastern shift is late, he muttered. From behind the hidden panel came a faint scrape. Martha looked toward the ovens. Grace dropped the clay bowl. It struck the floor and broke in 2. Martha flinched. Victor's attention snapped back to her. "My apologies," Grace said. She knelt immediately, gathering the pieces before either of them could move closer to the wall. Victor watched her for another breath. Then he smiled. It was not a kind expression. "If you see the man, do not feed him. Do not hide him. He may be dangerous." Grace kept her head lowered. "Of course, my lord." Victor and Martha left. Their footsteps faded down the corridor. Grace waited until the outer door closed before opening the woodroom. Henry stood in darkness, one hand braced against the wall. "You lied well," he said. "I lied badly. He simply wanted me frightened more than he wanted the truth." Henry stepped into the room. His gaze moved toward the corridor Victor had used. "He still controls the lower stores?" Grace looked at him. "Still." Henry's expression did not change. "I heard his name in the village. You also knew the southern gate was opened." Silence. "And the guard bells." Henry reached for his cloak. Grace noticed the pale mark on his finger again. The shape was too broad for a merchant's ring. "Who are you?" she asked. "A man who needs to know which grain wagons leave Ravenhall after midnight." "That is not an answer." "No." He moved toward the window and examined the courtyard through the frost. Grace watched him study the guards, count the wagons, and mark each locked door without appearing to do any of those things. A hungry old traveler would have looked for escape. Henry looked for evidence. 3 wagons left last night," Grace said. "Victor's men marked them as village relief." "Did they take the northern road?" "No, the western one." Henry closed his eyes briefly. Not surprise. Confirmation. Grace understood then that he had come to Ravenhall searching for something, and someone inside the castle had nearly killed him for getting too close. She did not ask his real name again. Instead, she handed him the last piece of bread. "You should finish this." Henry looked at it. "You no longer trust me." "I never said that." "Then why help me?" Grace glanced toward the corridor where Victor had disappeared. "Because whatever you are hiding, he is more afraid of it than I am." Victor returned before the bread was gone. This time he brought guards. Grace heard their boots in the corridor and understood immediately that the broken bowl had not distracted him. It had only delayed the question. Henry heard them too. He placed the bread on the table. "You should leave," Grace whispered. "There is no second exit." The coal passage. Henry looked toward the narrow iron hatch beside the ovens. "It opens into the lower courtyard." "Yes." "Victor's men are already there." Grace did not ask how he knew. The baking room door opened. Martha entered first, her face pale with anger. Victor followed behind her with 4 armed guards. His gaze moved from Grace to Henry. Something cold passed through his expression. Recognition. It vanished so quickly that Grace might have imagined it. "There you are," Victor said. Henry remained seated. "You have caused considerable trouble." "I have caused none," Henry replied. "Trouble rarely needs help." One guard stepped forward. Grace moved between them. She did not plan to. Her body simply understood what her mind had not yet accepted. If they took Henry through that door, he would not reach a public cell. Victor looked at her as if she were an object placed incorrectly. "Move." Grace stayed where she was. Martha seized her elbow. "Do not be foolish." "He is hungry," Grace said. "He is trespassing. He is injured. He may be a thief." Grace looked at Victor, then questioned him before witnesses. The room changed. Not visibly. The ovens remained cold. Snow still pressed white light against the window. But every guard became more attentive. Victor's smile disappeared. "You fed him from the royal stores." "I gave him my portion." "You concealed him." "Yes." Martha's fingers tightened around Grace's arm. "Apologize," she whispered. Now, Grace knew what the apology required. She would have to call Henry dangerous. She would have to say hunger had made her careless. She would have to step aside while Victor dragged an old man into the snow. Her position in Ravenhall paid for Samuel's bed, his winter boots, and the medicine that kept his cough from settling into his lungs. Losing it would not hurt only her. Victor seemed to see the calculation. "Kneel," he said. "Admit you stole from this castle, and I may permit you to remain." Henry looked at Grace. For the first time since she had found him, uncertainty entered his face. He could end this. She saw it in the way his hand moved toward the pale mark on his finger. One name, one command. Whatever identity he carried beneath the torn cloak would make these men stop. Then Henry's gaze shifted beyond Victor. 2 guards stood near the doorway. They were not watching Grace. They were watching Henry with the stillness of hunters waiting for prey to reveal its teeth. His hand lowered. Grace understood. He was not silent because he lacked power. He was silent because using it would expose him. She turned back to Victor. I will not kneel for feeding a starving man. Martha released her as though the words had burned. Victor studied Grace for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Dismissed, he said. The word struck harder than a slap. You no longer serve Ravenhall. Your wages are forfeit. Your room will be emptied before nightfall. Grace's throat tightened. She did not look at Henry. Take them both, Victor ordered. The guards moved. Grace stepped closer to Henry, placing herself between him and the first drawn hand. Victor's voice became quiet. Move, girl. Grace lifted her chin. No. A guard caught both her arms and pulled them behind her. Another seized Henry by the shoulder. Henry rose. Even weakened, he stood taller than every man except one. His eyes settled on Victor with an authority that did not belong to beggars. Victor noticed it. Fear flickered beneath his control. Then the outer courtyard erupted with the sound of horns. Not alarm horns. Royal horns. Every guard in the room went still. A voice thundered from beyond the kitchen doors. The Alpha King has returned. Henry closed his eyes. And for the first time, Grace saw relief break through his silence. The royal horns sounded 3 times. Every person in the baking room lowered their head. Every person except Henry. Grace noticed that before the kitchen doors opened, the air changed first. Voices disappeared from the corridor. Boots struck stone in a disciplined rhythm, followed by the heavy silence that traveled ahead of men accustomed to obedience. Then Alpha King Caleb Blackwood entered. He was taller than Grace had imagined, broad through the shoulders beneath black leather armor and a cloak edged with winter wolf fur. Snow clung to his dark hair. A pale scar crossed the hard line of his jaw, and his gray-blue eyes moved through the room with the cold precision of a blade searching for weakness. They passed over Victor, the guards, Grace's restrained arms, then stopped on Henry. Caleb did not breathe. The room seemed to hold itself still around him. Henry stood beside the cold oven in a torn cloak, Grace's faded wool scarf wrapped around his shoulders. Half an apple rested on the table. A wooden bowl sat beside the bread he had not finished. For one long moment, father and son only looked at each other. Caleb's face revealed nothing. His hands did. They opened slowly at his sides, as though he had forgotten he had been holding them closed. Father, he said. The word was barely louder than the fire settling beneath ash. Grace felt the guard behind her loosen his grip. Victor went pale. Henry's mouth moved with something too tired to become a smile. You took long enough. Caleb crossed the room. Not like a king approaching a throne. Like a son who had spent 3 days imagining a body beneath snow. He stopped before Henry, looking over the bruising near his temple, the torn sleeve, the hollowness hunger had carved beneath his cheekbones. Who did this? Henry glanced toward Victor. The movement was small. It was enough. Victor stepped forward quickly. Your Majesty, we found this man concealed by the maid. We had not yet confirmed his identity. Caleb turned. The temperature in the room seemed to fall. You failed to recognize the former Alpha King. He was disguised. He was standing in my castle. Victor swallowed. The girl hid him. Caleb's gaze shifted to Grace. She wished he had looked angry. Anger would have been easier than the quiet examination in his eyes. Henry reached for the table when his knees weakened. Grace moved instinctively. The guard still holding her arms pulled her back. Release her, Caleb said. The man obeyed before the final word had fully left the king's mouth. Grace caught Henry just as his weight shifted. Caleb reached him from the other side, one powerful hand closing around his father's arm. Together, they steadied him. Caleb looked at Grace's hand beneath Henry's elbow, then at the empty bowl. You fed him. Grace lowered her eyes. Yes, Your Majesty. With what? My own portion. Why? The question was not cruel. That made it harder to answer. Because he was hungry. Caleb looked toward Victor, Martha, and the guards who had entered with him. No one met his eyes. Henry leaned against the table, breathing carefully. This one fed me, he said. The rest of you searched past me. Caleb went completely still. Not because his father was alive. Grace understood that now. He was speechless because an entire castle had seen a nameless old man in torn clothing and decided he was beneath notice. A maid with one meal had seen more. Caleb turned back to her. What is your name? Grace Bennett. Before he could speak again, Henry's fingers tightened around her wrist. His face lost what little color remained. The wooden bowl slipped from the table and shattered against the floor. Henry collapsed between them. Grace dropped to her knees. Caleb caught his father's shoulders. Send for the royal healer. As guards rushed from the room, Victor stared at the broken bowl. Then he pointed at Grace. She poisoned him. The accusation entered the room before the healer did. She poisoned him. Victor's voice was calm. Too calm. Grace remained on her knees beside Henry, one hand pressed against the side of his neck. His pulse was there, but wrong. Fast, then faint. His breathing came in shallow pulls, as though something inside him had tightened around his lungs. Caleb looked at Victor. Be certain before you speak again. Victor lowered his head. The bowl came from her hands, Your Majesty. So did the food that kept him alive. The poison may have been delayed. Grace looked at the broken pieces scattered across the floor. Thin vegetable broth darkened the stone. A strip of apple peel clung to one shard. Nothing about it smelled bitter or strange. But the spoon did. A faint sweetness remained along the wooden handle. Not from fruit. From nitroot. Grace had smelled it once in the lower infirmary when a stable boy swallowed the wrong medicine. Sweet at first, then metallic. The spoon, she said. Victor's eyes moved toward her. Grace reached for it. A guard caught her wrist. Do not touch anything, Victor ordered. Caleb's gaze sharpened. She identified it. She is creating a distraction. The royal healer rushed into the room, carrying a leather case. He knelt beside Henry, checked his eyes, then pressed 2 fingers beneath his jaw. What did he eat? Bread, Grace said. Soup. Half an apple. From where? The bread was mine. The soup came from the servant's pot. Victor pointed toward the shattered bowl. And she served all of it. The healer smelled the spoon. His face changed. Nitroot. A murmur passed through the guards. Caleb did not look away from Grace. Can you save him? If the dose was small. And if it was not. The healer opened his case. Then we have very little time. As he worked, 2 guards searched the room under Victor's direction. Grace watched them open shelves, overturn baskets, and examine every jar near the ovens. One guard entered the woodroom. He returned holding a small green bottle. This was beneath the blankets. Grace stared at it. I have never seen that. Victor removed the stopper without touching the rim and held it toward the healer. The same sweet smell filled the air. Nitroot. The room seemed to draw away from Grace. Then the second guard lifted something from her discarded cloak. A heavy silver ring. A black wolf surrounded by iron thorns had been carved into its face. Caleb's expression emptied. Henry's royal signet. Victor turned it beneath the light. She hid the former king, kept his ring, and fed him poison. I did not put those there. Of course not. Grace stood slowly. Every eye followed her. The room that had seen her feed a starving man now saw only the evidence arranged around her. Caleb stepped between Grace and the guards before she realized they had moved. Did you know who he was? He asked. No. Did he give you the ring? No. Did anyone enter this room after you found him? Grace looked toward Martha. Then toward Victor. Yes. Victor's jaw tightened. The Lord Chancellor came here twice. Silence settled over the room. Caleb turned toward him. Victor smiled carefully. To search for the intruder. Grace pointed at the bottle. The wax on the stopper is blue. Caleb looked at it. Victor did not. The servants' stores use brown wax, Grace continued. The infirmary uses white. Blue belongs to the sealed provisions beneath the Western Archive. Victor's private stores. For the first time, fear crossed his face. Only for a moment. Then Henry convulsed. The healer shouted for water. Caleb dropped beside his father. Victor stepped backward toward the door. Grace saw him move. So did Caleb. Without turning, the Alpha King spoke. Close the room. The guards barred the exit. Victor stopped. Caleb looked up from his father, his gray-blue eyes colder than the winter beyond the windows. No one leaves until I know who tried to kill him. Caleb questioned Grace while the healer worked. Not gently. Not cruelly. Precisely. Where was the bowl? On the second shelf beside the flour bin. Who touched it? I did. Martha may have when she inspected the room. Martha stiffened. I touched nothing. Grace looked at her hands. A fine dusting of flour covered the left sleeve of Martha's dress, but not the right. She had leaned against the shelf earlier when Victor entered. Caleb noticed Grace looking. What? The shelf was clean before Lord Victor came the first time. Victor gave a quiet laugh. You expect the king to trust the memory of a frightened maid? Grace turned toward him. Yes. The word surprised everyone. It surprised Grace most of all. But she knew that room. She knew the number of bowls on each shelf, which oven door dragged against stone, and where every sack had been placed before sunrise. Her survival had depended on noticing what others considered too small to matter. Caleb's expression did not change. Continue. Grace pointed toward the flour bin. The sack beside the bowl was moved. One guard glanced at it. It is still there. The seam faces the wall. No one spoke. Grace stepped closer, though two guards followed her carefully. Kitchen sacks are stored with the stitched side facing outward. If mice tear the thread, we see it immediately. That one was turned around. Caleb gave Ethan a brief nod. The captain lifted the sack. Beneath it lay a smear of blue wax. Victor's face remained calm. His right hand did not. Two fingers pressed against his palm, rubbing together as though trying to remove something invisible. Grace looked toward the green bottle. The wax came from the same seal. Blue wax is used throughout the western wing, Victor said. No, Grace replied. Only beneath the archive. How would a maid know that? Because I carry your inventory ledgers there every 5th morning. Victor fell silent. Caleb turned to the guard holding Henry's signet. Where exactly did you find the ring? In her cloak, Your Majesty. Which pocket? The guard hesitated. The inner one. Grace shook her head. My cloak has no inner pocket. The guard looked down. The room tightened around him. Caleb rose slowly. Show me. The cloak was brought forward. A narrow slit had been cut into the lining and stitched again with dark green thread. Not kitchen thread. The same color used on Victor's formal coat. Ethan pulled at the seam. The stitches came loose easily. Victor stepped toward the door. The guards crossed their spears before him. Caleb faced Grace again. When did you last wear the cloak? Before dawn. Was the lining damaged? No. Who handled it afterward? Grace looked toward the table where Victor had thrown it during the search. He did. Victor's restraint finally cracked. This is absurd. You are allowing a servant to build accusations from flour and thread while your father lies dying. Caleb crossed the room. He stopped close enough that Victor had to raise his chin. My father lies dying because someone believed servants would never be asked what they saw. The healer spoke from the floor. The antidote is working. Caleb turned immediately. Color had begun to return to Henry's face. His breathing remained weak, but steady. Grace released a breath she had not realized she was holding. Then Henry's eyes opened. They found Caleb first. Then Grace. Finally Victor. He was on the western road. Henry whispered. Caleb knelt beside him. Who? Henry's hand trembled as he pointed. Victor. The Lord Chancellor went white. Henry swallowed painfully. He knew I was coming. Caleb looked over his shoulder. The guard seized Victor before he could move. But Grace watched his face and understood something the others had not yet seen. Victor was afraid. Not of arrest. Of what Henry might say next. Henry's next words changed the room. The grain wagons were empty. Caleb remained beside his father's bed while the guards held Victor near the barred door. The Lord Chancellor had stopped protesting. He watched Henry with the fixed attention of a man counting how much truth remained alive. Henry closed his eyes briefly. The villages received half their winter allotment. Perhaps less. The records showed full deliveries. Caleb's expression hardened. You went north to inspect them. I went without banners. Without guards. With guards, I would have seen only what Victor prepared for me. Victor laughed once. A dying man's confusion is not evidence. Henry opened his eyes. Weakness had reduced his voice. It had not reduced his authority. I followed the western road for 6 nights. Grain wagons left Ravenhall marked for the northern villages. They crossed the river, changed their seals, and continued toward the border markets. Grace thought of the wagons she had seen from the kitchen yard. Always after midnight. Always covered. Always listed as relief shipments. The bread stores, she whispered. Caleb looked at her. Grace stepped toward the shelves. For 3 months, the kitchen ledgers have shown more flour arriving than we received. Martha blamed damaged sacks and mice. Martha's face lost color. I repeated the numbers I was given. By whom? Caleb asked. Her gaze moved toward Victor. No one needed the answer spoken. Henry struggled to sit higher. Caleb supported him carefully. I found the false ledgers in a roadside chapel. Henry continued. Victor's men found me before I could reach the eastern gate. The wound beneath your sleeve, Grace said. A blade. And the poison? Placed in my water before the attack. A smaller dose than today. Enough to weaken me. Not enough to kill me before they learned where I had hidden the records. Victor's calm broke. There are no records. Henry looked toward Grace. The ring. Every face turned to the royal signet resting on the table. Grace frowned. You placed it in my cloak? In your linen basket, Henry said. Before Victor returned, Caleb picked up the heavy silver ring. Henry pointed weakly toward the black wolf carved into its face. The crest opens. Ethan pressed his thumb against the iron thorn border. A hidden hinge released. Inside the ring lay a narrow strip of folded parchment. Names, amounts, dates. The marks of merchants, guards, and 3 border lords appeared beneath Victor's seal. Caleb read in silence. The stillness that entered him was more dangerous than anger. Henry looked at Grace. I knew Victor would search me. But not her, Ethan said. No one searches what they do not consider important. Grace felt the truth of that sentence like cold entering old scars. Victor had looked through her. So had Martha. So had nearly everyone in Ravenhall. Henry had used their contempt against them. Victor pulled against the guards. That parchment proves trade. Nothing more. Grace moved closer to the table. She recognized the numbers. Not because she understood royal accounts. Because she understood bread. These quantities are wrong. Caleb looked at her. Grace pointed to the 3rd column. This says 400 sacks left the lower storehouse in one night. Yes. The western gate cannot pass 400 sacks before dawn. Not with winter ice. The carts would need 2 nights. Ethan's eyes sharpened. Which means the 2nd shipment never left. Grace turned toward Victor. It is still inside Ravenhall. Victor's face emptied. Henry smiled faintly. That, he whispered, is why I needed someone who knew the castle better than the men who ruled it. Caleb stood. Seal the Western Archive. Search every cellar beneath it. Victor began to struggle. Too late. The guards dragged him from the room. Grace remained beside Henry as the door closed. He looked at the empty bowl on the floor. You thought you gave me 1 meal. Grace said nothing. Henry's tired eyes softened. You gave me enough time to bring a kingdom its truth. The Western Archive opened before sunset. Behind its lowest wall, Ethan's men found the missing grain. Not 400 sacks. Nearly 2,000. They had been stacked in darkness beneath false ledgers, foreign seals, and crates of winter medicine marked for villages that had already begun burying children. By nightfall, Victor Hale stood before the full council in chains. The great hall had been cleared of servants except Grace. That was Caleb's order. She stood beside the long accounting table in her plain cream dress, her apron freshly washed but still worn thin at the edges. Henry sat near the throne beneath a heavy wool blanket, pale but upright. The royal healer remained at his side. Victor looked smaller without his silver chain. Not harmless. Only exposed. Lord Ashford lifted the hidden ledger. These records bear the Chancellor's seal. Victor raised his chin. A seal can be copied. Ethan placed the royal signet beside it. The names inside the former king's ring match every payment. Then the old man forged them. The room changed. Henry did not move. Caleb did. He rose from the throne with such controlled stillness that every alpha at the council table lowered his eyes. You will address him as the former king. Victor smiled faintly. Even kings grow confused. Grace saw what he was doing. He could not destroy the evidence, so he would make the witnesses seem unworthy of belief. An old man weakened by poison. A kitchen made with no rank. People powerful men had learned to dismiss. Victor looked toward Grace. And now this entire accusation depends upon a servant who counts flour sacks. Grace felt the attention of the hall settle on her. Months earlier, she would have lowered her gaze. She would have apologized for standing in the wrong place. Instead, she walked to the table. The accusation does not depend on me, she said. Victor laughed. No, it depends on numbers you assume no one beneath you could understand. Grace opened the kitchen ledger. You recorded 400 sacks leaving the western gate on the 12th night of winter. She placed the gate log beside it. The first wagon entered the passage after midnight. The last left before the 5th bell. Victor said nothing. Grace continued. A loaded grain cart needs 6 minutes to cross the western ramp in winter ice. Longer if the axle is old. Ravenhall owns 12 carts wide enough for these sacks. Lord Ashford began calculating beneath his breath. Grace pointed to the final entry. Even if every cart moved without stopping, fewer than 200 sacks could have passed before the 5th bell. Silence spread across the council table. The rest never left, Grace said. You hid them beneath the archive and sold the first shipment across the border to make the records appear complete. Victor's face tightened. You expect nobles to trust kitchen arithmetic? Henry's voice crossed the hall. I do. Every head turned. He pushed himself upright despite the healer's protest. This woman gave me her meal when she had almost nothing. She hid me when doing so cost her employment. She remembered what every lord in this room overlooked because she has spent years surviving among details. Victor pulled against his chains. She is a maid. Caleb descended from the platform. Each step sounded clearly against the stone. When he stopped before Victor, the Lord Chancellor finally looked afraid. You saw my father starving and chose to drag him into the snow, Caleb said. She saw a man who needed food. Victor's mouth opened. Caleb did not allow him to speak. You stole from villages. You poisoned the man who exposed you. You planted evidence on the woman who saved him. He turned toward the guards. Remove his seal. Seize his lands. Every coin recovered will purchase grain and medicine for the northern settlements. Victor was taken away beneath the eyes of the court he had controlled for years. No one spoke until the doors closed. Then Caleb faced Grace. Martha stood among the servants at the rear of the hall. Her eyes were lowered. Caleb took a bronze key from Ethan. The winter stores require a keeper. Grace stared at it. Your Majesty, I am not trained for court office. No, Caleb said. You are trained to notice when food disappears, when records lie, and when hungry people are ignored. He placed the key in her hand. Those qualifications appear rarer. A few council members smiled. Most did not. Grace preferred the honesty of that. Henry pulled out the chair beside him. The woman who fed me eats here. Grace hesitated. She had served at tables like this. Cleared them. Stood behind them while others ate. Caleb noticed. He broke a loaf of warm bread and placed half on the empty plate before her. You do not have to be hungry here, he said. Grace looked at Henry, then at Caleb. Neither man looked away. She sat, and for the first time in Ravenhall, no one asked her to leave. 3 weeks after Victor's arrest, Grace found 6 empty bowls outside the winter storehouse. They had been placed in a straight line beneath the eastern wall before dawn. Each bowl was clean. Each contained 1 grain of wheat. Not a threat. A message. Someone in Ravenhall was still hungry. Grace stood in the snow with the bronze storehouse key cold against her palm. The new wool cloak Henry had given her protected her shoulders, but the wind found every opening near her wrists. Behind her, the lower courtyard was beginning to wake. Stable boys carried water. Bakers pushed carts toward the kitchens. Guards changed positions beneath the Black Wolf banners. No one asked why the keeper of the winter stores was examining empty bowls. They had learned not to. Grace followed the small footprints leading from the wall. They disappeared near the servants' laundry. Inside, she found 4 children hiding behind baskets of damp linen. 2 belonged to kitchen workers. One was the son of a guard injured during Victor's arrest. The youngest girl wore boots too large for her feet and held Samuel's hand. Grace stopped. Her brother looked older than 14 in that moment. Not because his face had changed, because he had learned to be ashamed of needing help. I told them you would understand, Samuel said. Grace looked at the children. When did you last eat? No one answered. She knew that silence. It was the same silence Henry had carried into the abandoned baking room. Grace opened the winter storehouse before sunrise. By breakfast, every servant household in Ravenhall had received bread, dried meat, oats, and 2 measures of flour. By midday, she had found 17 names missing from the official ration list. By evening, she understood why. Victor's clerks had not stolen only from villages. They had removed widows, injured workers, and orphaned children from the castle records, then sold their portions with the grain shipments. Grace carried the altered ledgers into the council chamber. Caleb was alone at the long table, reading border reports beneath a circle of candles. He looked up when she entered. You found another problem. It was not a question. 17. His expression hardened. Names. People. Grace placed the ledgers before him. That is why no one noticed. Caleb read the first page. The silence between them changed. Grace had begun to recognize his different silences. The one he used while measuring danger. The one that came before anger. The quieter one that appeared whenever he discovered how thoroughly his kingdom had failed someone. How do we correct it, he asked. Grace had expected an order. Not the question. We stopped treating food as a reward for usefulness. Every person living under Ravenhall's roof receives a fixed ration. Rank changes the table they eat at, not whether they eat. Caleb leaned back. Several council lords would object. Grace could already hear their arguments about cost, tradition, and servants becoming comfortable. Do it, he said. She blinked. That easily? No, his gaze held hers. That clearly. He signed the order. Grace gathered the papers, but Caleb placed one hand over the final ledger. You have not eaten. She looked toward the untouched plate beside him. Warm bread. Stew. A sliced apple. I was working. So was I. That is different. Why? Grace opened her mouth. No answer came. Caleb pushed the second chair away from the table. Not the formal chair beside the throne. A plain wooden one close to the fire. Sit. It was an invitation disguised as a command. Grace sat. Caleb divided the bread between them. Outside, snow covered Ravenhall's roofs, hiding every old road and footprint. Inside, the former maid and the Alpha King ate from the same loaf, while 17 forgotten names were restored to the kingdom's records. Grace understood then that feeding the hungry had never been the smallest duty in Ravenhall. It was the first measure of whether the kingdom deserved to survive. The first wagon reached the northern village with bread still warm beneath its canvas. Grace noticed that before she noticed the crowd. Steam escaped when the driver lifted the covering, carrying the smell of wheat and salt into the frozen square. Children stopped beside doorways. Women came out holding empty baskets. Men who had spent months pretending not to be weak stood very still, as though moving too quickly might cause the food to disappear. Grace understood that stillness. She had seen it in Henry when he counted crumbs. The convoy stretched along the road behind her. 12 wagons of grain, medicine, blankets, dried meat, and lamp oil. Each carried Ravenhall's seal. Each had been counted by Grace before departure and would be counted again before the drivers returned. Caleb had assigned 40 guards to protect it. Grace had assigned 6 kitchen workers to make certain no one was sent away hungry while officials argued over names. A little girl approached the first wagon. She could not have been older than 7. Her wool dress was too thin, and one boot had been tied closed with twine. She stared at the bread, but kept both hands behind her back. Grace knelt. Are you waiting for someone? The girl shook her head. Then why not take one? My name might not be written down. Grace looked toward the village clerk. He lowered his eyes. Victor's ledgers had taught people that food belonged first to records and only afterward to the living. Grace lifted a loaf from the wagon and placed it in the girl's hands. Then we will write it down after you eat. The child held the bread against her chest. Behind Grace, someone exhaled softly. Caleb stood near the stone well, dressed in black leather beneath a heavy winter cloak. Even without a crown, he changed the shape of the square. Guards straightened. Villagers bowed. Space opened around him without request. But his attention remained on Grace. Not the wagons. Not the officials. Her. Henry stood beside him, supported by a carved walking stick he complained about whenever anyone called it necessary. His strength had returned slowly, along with the sharpness in his voice. She did the same thing to me, he told the girl. Grace rose. You were less polite. I was starving. So is she. Henry smiled. The distribution continued until sunset. No family was turned away. When the written records failed, Grace sent workers from house to house. When one clerk claimed the village had received enough grain, she made him open the storehouse and count the empty bins himself. Caleb watched without interfering. That was how his respect had changed. At first, he had protected her voice. Now he trusted it to command. By nightfall, fires burned in every village home. Grace stood at the edge of the square, rubbing warmth back into her fingers. Snow had begun to fall, soft enough to settle on Caleb's dark hair when he approached. You have not eaten, he said. I had bread in the wagon. You gave it to the girl. There was more. You gave that away too. Grace looked toward the homes glowing beyond the square. It seemed more useful there. Caleb held out a wrapped piece of bread and cheese. She accepted it, not because he was king, because he had remembered. They ate beside the well while the guards loaded the empty baskets. Henry had already gone inside the village hall, where he was telling anyone who listened that his son had required a maid to teach him how a kingdom should be fed. Caleb glanced toward the building. He enjoys humiliating me. He enjoys being alive enough to do it. That too. Grace smiled. The expression in Caleb's eyes changed. It had happened more often in recent weeks. The cold assessment remained when he faced councils, threats, and border disputes. With her, Something quieter had begun to appear beneath it. Something careful. I brought another order, he said. Grace sighed. How many names are missing this time? None. Then what is it? He removed a folded parchment from inside his cloak. The royal seal rested at the bottom. Grace read the first line. Keeper of the winter stores and voice of the northern villages. Her breath caught. This gives me a seat on the council. Yes. They will object. They already have. And I reminded them that hunger is more dangerous to a kingdom than wounded pride. Grace looked at him. That sounds almost wise. I have had an unusual teacher. Snow gathered on the parchment between them. Caleb extended his hand. Not a command. Not a reward. An invitation. Come back to Ravenhall with me, he said. Not behind my procession. Beside me. Grace placed her hand in his. When they entered the village hall, Henry had saved 2 places at the high table. One for his son. One for the maid who had fed him when no one knew his name. Grace sat between them, and when the bread was passed, Caleb made certain her plate was filled first. The council objected before Grace reached her chair. Not loudly. Men who believed themselves civilized rarely began with shouting. They began with silence, exchanged glances, and the careful clearing of throats. Grace entered Ravenhall's council chamber beside Caleb, with snow still melting along the hem of her blue wool cloak. Henry followed behind them, leaning on his carved stick and refusing Ethan's offered arm. The chair at Caleb's right had been placed there that morning. Everyone noticed it. Lord Ashford rose first. Your Majesty, the northern villages deserve representation. But a permanent seat on the royal council has never been granted to a servant. Grace felt the old word find its familiar place beneath her ribs. Servant. It had once explained everything she was permitted to be. Caleb removed his gloves. She is not here to discuss what she was. Ashford looked toward Grace. And what is she now? Grace placed the restored ration ledgers on the table. The person who knows your southern estate claimed 30 sacks of grain for 12 households. The Lord's expression changed. Only slightly. It was enough. Grace opened the first ledger. 3 of those households have been empty since autumn. 2 families moved west. One name belongs to a man buried 6 years ago. Silence arrived. Not shock. Calculation. Ashford sat slowly. Grace moved to the next entry. Lord Merrick's steward requested medicine for 40 injured workers. His quarry employs 23. Merrick's fingers tightened around his cup. The remaining supplies were sold in the river market 3 days later. You accuse my steward of theft? I accuse the numbers of refusing to lie for him. Henry lowered himself into his chair with visible satisfaction. Caleb did not smile. His eyes remained on the council. Continue, he said. Grace did. For the next hour, she read names no noble had expected her to know. Widows removed from food rolls. Children recorded as able-bodied workers. Villages charged for wagons that never arrived. Every deception had survived because it appeared small when viewed from a throne. Grace had never viewed the kingdom from a throne. She had viewed it from kitchens, storerooms, servants' doors, and the empty side of a bread table. When she finished, no one questioned the chair. That should have been victory enough. It was not. A guard entered carrying a sealed message from the southern border. Caleb broke the wax and read in silence. What is it? Henry asked. 3 villages have refused the winter levy. Merrick exhaled sharply. Rebellion. No, Grace said. The word left her before caution could stop it. Several council members turned. Merrick's eyes narrowed. You have not read the message. I do not need to. Caleb handed it to her. The villages had sent no soldiers, raised no banners, threatened no violence. They had simply locked their grain houses. Grace looked up. They are not refusing the crown. They are afraid Ravenhall will take what remains. Merrick laughed. Fear does not excuse disobedience. No, Grace replied. But hunger explains it. Caleb watched her. What would you do? Go there. The chamber went still again. With soldiers? Ashford asked. With wagons. Grace folded the message. We return what was stolen before we ask for anything more. Henry's expression softened. Caleb rose. Then we leave at dawn. Merrick stared at him. You would follow a maid into a defiant territory? Caleb's gaze became cold. No, he walked around the table and stopped beside Grace. I would follow the woman who fed my father when this court would have left him outside. No one answered. Caleb pulled out the chair at his right. Grace looked at it, then at the council that had once considered her too unimportant to question. She sat. Caleb placed the southern message before her. Tell us what the kingdom needs. Grace rested both hands on the table. First, she said, it needs to learn the difference between obedience and trust. Outside, the bells of Ravenhall began to ring for the evening meal. Inside, every man who had once spoken over her remained silent. And this time, they were listening.